Have mercy, Cowboy. My body will give you powerful
我没打
offspring,
算跑。
begged the captive Apache woman. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The basin held its nighttime stillness without offering comfort. The cold had settled hours earlier, and now every rock, brush patch, and strip of dirt looked sharper under the thin starlight. Jonas Reddick guided his horse at a slow pace, the reins loose in one hand while the other steadied the lantern hook to his saddle horn. He had been out longer than planned, searching for signs of cattle straying from the range. A broken fence line earlier in the week made him wary, and he didn't like leaving things unchecked when dusk had already passed. Jonas had spent most of his adult life avoiding unnecessary trouble. Years before, he had scouted for the army, following orders that led to consequences he could not forget. Once he left that work behind, he bought a small stretch of land far from crowded towns and built a plain cabin with his own hands. His plan was simple: keep to himself, maintain a quiet existence, and avoid choices that could cost someone else their life. Solitude became a habit, not because he enjoyed it, but because he trusted himself more than anyone else. Tonight should have been predictable. Ride the perimeter, check the old trail, return home before the cold cut too deep. Instead, the lantern revealed something he hadn't expected: a broken wagon sitting crooked near a shallow ditch, one wheel nearly snapped in half. Supplies were scattered on the ground, blankets half buried in dust, and a barrel tipped on its side with water soaking into the dirt. Jonas tightened his grip on the reins. Wagons left in this state usually meant trouble close by. Drifters passing through often traveled in rough groups, and abandoned gear wasn't their usual pattern unless something went wrong. He stopped the horse and let it stand while he dismounted. Each step he took was slow and deliberate, his boots pressing into the dirt with a steady rhythm. He held the lantern low, looking for movement, tracks, shadows, anything alive. The silence around him didn't ease. It felt too controlled, too empty, like whoever had been here left fast and didn't look back. Then he saw her. A woman was tied to a wagon stake hammered deep into the ground, her body slumped forward, arms bound at the wrists. Her long dark hair hung in tangled strands around her face, partially hiding the dirt and swelling along her cheekbone. Her legs were pulled close to her chest, and her breath rattled from exhaustion. Jonas froze for a second, startled not by her presence, but by how close she was to losing consciousness. He moved toward her slowly, setting the lantern down so the light spread across her face. Her eyelids fluttered. She tried to lift her head but could barely manage it. When her gaze met his, fear surged through her expression, an immediate, defensive recognition that any stranger could be worse than the men who left her here. Her voice came out strained, barely steady. "Show mercy, Cowboy. I can give you children, strong ones, just don't leave me." Jonas exhaled through his nose, not angry at her words, but at the desperation behind them. In her condition, she had no reason to expect safety. He crouched beside her, keeping enough distance so she wouldn't feel trapped. He reached for his knife and angled it so she could see the blade wasn't aimed at her body. "I'm cutting you free," he said, tone calm and even. He sliced the rope cleanly. The fibers fell aside, leaving deep red marks across her wrists. She didn't move at first, as though her mind couldn't accept that the restraint was gone. Jonas waited, watching her reaction. Her breathing shifted into uneven, shaky pulls, and her fingers twitched as sensation returned. "Can you stand?" he asked. She tried, but her legs buckled. Jonas moved closer, offering his arms slowly. She hesitated, eyes flicking toward the open land, judging whether she should run, collapse, or accept help. Survival instinct pushed against exhaustion, and exhaustion won. She leaned toward him. He lifted her with careful strength, avoiding contact that might frighten her. She weighed less than he expected, thin from hunger, drained from fear. He carried her to the horse, secured her in the saddle, then mounted behind her to keep her balanced. Her shoulders shook each time the horse moved, but she didn't resist. It wasn't trust. It was the last of her strength giving out. The ride back to the cabin took time. Jonas kept his eyes on the horizon, watching for riders who might return to claim what they had abandoned. The woman's breathing steadied once the horse found a smooth rhythm. She rested her head forward, her hair brushing against his coat. Jonas didn't speak. Words wouldn't help her right now, and he didn't offer comfort he wasn't sure she would accept. When his cabin finally came into view, the lantern light from his window flickered faintly through the dark. The small structure sat on a slight rise overlooking the basin, surrounded by a fence that had seen better years. Jonas dismounted and caught her before she slid from the saddle, lifting her again with steady arms. Inside, the warmth from a stone stove wrapped around them. Jonas set her down on a blanket near the fire and moved back immediately so she wouldn't feel cornered. She watched him closely, her eyes sharp despite her exhaustion. "You're safe for now," he said. "I won't touch you." She swallowed hard, not fully believing him. Her voice trembled. "You don't want anything?" Jonas removed his coat, hung it on the wall, and kneeled to add more wood to the stove. "Not from you." Her shoulders shifted slightly, a small release of tension, not trust, but confusion that he wasn't asking for anything. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, trying to absorb warmth she hadn't felt in days. Jonas poured water into a tin cup and set it beside her. "Drink when you can." Slowly. She didn't reach for it yet. Her eyes stayed on him, watching for signs of threat. Jonas recognized the look. He had seen it in people who expected harm before help. He didn't push her drink or ask who she was or why she'd been tied up. Questions could come later. For now, the only thing that mattered was keeping her alive through the night. Jonas sat across the room, near the door, letting the fire do its work while she studied him with wary, exhausted eyes. The cabin held its quiet, and for the first time since he found her, the tension in the room settled into something steady, fragile, but not dangerous. She wasn't ready to believe him, but she was no longer alone in the dark. The first hints of morning crept into the basin in a thin gray band, barely reaching the cabin windows. Inside, the stove still held a deep glow from the night fire. Tala lay awake on the blanket Jonas had given her, her eyes tracing every detail of the room with guarded focus. Sleep had come only in short, shallow bursts. Each time the wind shifted outside, she jolted back to full awareness, expecting someone else to be standing over her. Jonas stepped out from the small corner where he kept his tools, already dressed and lacing his boots. He hadn't slept much either, though his quiet movements hid the fatigue in his eyes. His thoughts stayed fixed on the events of the night, the wagon, the rope marks on her wrists, the way she offered her body because she believed it was the only thing of value she possessed. He knew that kind of fear didn't fade because the fire was warm. He approached slowly, keeping a respectful distance. "I'll check the yard," he said, voice low. "Firewood stocked. Water's on the table if you want it." She stared at him as if waiting for a command he hadn't given. Her hand stayed inside the blanket, fingers clenching the fabric. Jonas opened the door and stepped into the cold. Outside, frost coated the ground in thin patches. Jonas walked the perimeter, scanning for fresh tracks. His experience from years of scouting sharpened his attention. No hoof prints, no boot marks, no sign of returning drifters. He felt the tightness in his shoulders relax by a small margin. This place was isolated, and isolation worked in their favor. Still, he checked every corner of the yard because mistakes in judgment weren't something he allowed himself anymore. When he finally returned inside, Tala was sitting upright. She held the tin cup in both hands but hadn't taken a sip. Jonas set his gloves on the table and crouched beside the stove to adjust the dampers. "You need food," he said, not looking directly at her. "I'll warm something." "I can eat," she answered softly, though her voice carried uncertainty. Jonas ladled warm broth from a pot he'd heated earlier. He placed the bowl near her and stepped back so she wouldn't feel pressured. She tasted a small spoonful and paused. Her breathing steadied as she swallowed carefully. Hunger pushed her forward, and she finished half the bowl before stopping again, studying him over the rim. "You brought me here without knowing who I am," she said. "No name came with you," Jonas responded. "Tala." He nodded once. Jonas. She studied him in a long, searching silence. Why risk trouble for someone you've never seen? Jonas rested his elbows on his knees, hands hanging loosely. You were tied to a stake in the cold. That was enough. That answer says nothing, she whispered, not accusing, just confused. It says what it needs to. Tala set the bowl aside. Her fingers brushed the rope marks on her wrists, as if confirming they were real. The men who left me believed I was worth something to someone else, she said quietly. Not for my voice, not for my mind. Jonas didn't interrupt. When they tied me, they said someone would buy me before dawn. They laughed at how desperate I must look. Jonas's jaw tightened briefly. That didn't happen. She blinked, unsettled by the certainty in his tone. But you could have taken advantage. You didn't. I've made enough mistakes for one lifetime, he said. His words landed heavier than he intended. Plain, honest, without explanation. Tala didn't press him further. She lowered her gaze, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders. Jonas stood and retrieved a small crate from the corner. I need to check the water lines and the fencing before noon. You can stay near the fire. It's warmer here. You expect me to remain inside? I expect you to rest. Nothing more. She hesitated before answering. You treat me like a person. You are one. Tala looked away, caught off guard by how simply he said it. She wasn't used to being regarded without suspicion or ownership. Jonas put on his coat. If you hear anything outside, don't open the door. Let me handle it. Her expression tightened with concern. Do you think they're coming back? I don't know. That's why I check. As he stepped out, Tala watched him through the crack in the curtain. His figure moved across the yard with a steady, deliberate pace. Every step showed caution, but not fear. She found herself wondering what burden he carried that made him live so far from others. What mistake weighed so heavily that he chose silence over company. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled softly. Tala pulled the blanket closer around her body and studied the room once more. Tools, worn boots, a rifle cleaned and set aside, a bed neatly arranged, all signs of a man who relied entirely on himself. It made her wonder what he expected from her, though so far he had asked nothing. For the first time since being tied to that stake, she allowed herself to breathe without flinching. Not fully, not safely, but differently, cautious hope mixing with uncertainty. Jonas worked outside, tightening the fencing and checking every post while thinking about the woman inside his home. He never planned to be responsible for anyone again. Yet ignoring her suffering would have made him no better than the men he despised. By midday, the frost had melted, and the basin settled into its usual dry quiet. Jonas finished his rounds and returned to the cabin with one clear realization. He couldn't send her away. Not yet. Not while danger still hovered close enough to return. Inside, Tala sat upright, alert, waiting for him, her posture no longer collapsed from fear, but sharpened by readiness. She didn't speak first. He didn't hurry to break the silence. The cabin's warmth stretched between them, thin, fragile, but real enough to shift something in the air neither of them fully understood yet. The midday light reached the cabin in clear, pale streaks, revealing the dust that drifted across the yard in restless movements. Tala stood near the door with the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. She hadn't asked permission to step outside, but she waited until Jonas finished removing his coat and shook the cold off his hands. Her posture carried a quiet plea she didn't voice, the need to see the land beyond the walls that had kept her safe through the night. You want air? Jonas asked, noticing how she kept glancing toward the fading sunlight. She nodded, fingers tightening around the blanket's edges. Jonas opened the door and stepped aside, letting her choose the pace. Tala walked out carefully, her bare feet touching the hardened ground with hesitancy. She scanned the yard first, then the hills beyond, checking for movement the same way someone who had spent too long in danger might. Jonas watched her from a few steps behind, allowing her space to reclaim her surroundings without feeling watched. The wind picked up slightly, lifting strands of her hair. The blanket fluttered against her arms, revealing bruises along her shoulders and the faint outline of old marks that didn't come from recent captivity. She pulled the blanket tighter, speaking before she had time to doubt the sound of her own voice. I thought the men would come back during the night. Jonas leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed loosely. If they'd wanted you, they wouldn't have left you tied. They were done with you. Her jaw tightened. She didn't argue, but the truth of his words stung. She turned away from the cabin and looked toward the dead wagon, still faintly visible in the distance. I didn't think I'd see morning. You did, Jonas replied. That counts. Tala's throat tightened with something she couldn't name. Gratitude felt too heavy. Fear still hovered under her skin. But standing upright, in open air, made her feel less like a trapped thing and more like someone trying to regain control of her body. Jonas took a few steps toward the shed. I need to fix the hinge that froze last winter, he said. You can stay near the porch. Don't wander far. Because of riders? She asked. Because this land doesn't forgive mistakes. He paused, then added, and because I'd rather know where you are. The admission surprised her, though he said it plainly, without claiming ownership or making demands. She followed him as far as the porch and sat on the edge, watching as he removed the metal hinge, wiped off the rust, and set to work with a file. His shoulders moved in slow, controlled rhythms, as if every task had a cadence learned through years of repetition. After several minutes, she spoke again. What happened to make you leave people behind? Jonas kept filing without looking at her. Orders I followed. Lives lost. Took me a while to understand what part one played. Do you think helping me changes that? No, he said, but leaving you there would have made it worse. Tala absorbed his words, recognizing a kind of guilt she understood too well. People carried wounds that didn't show on skin. Hers came from men who treated her as property. His seemed rooted in choices that kept him awake at night. She slid the blanket off her shoulders and folded it neatly beside her. The cold brushed her skin but didn't stop her. She wanted to feel something other than fear. What should I do while you fix things? She asked. Whatever you want, Jonas said, tightening the screws he'd just cleaned. You don't owe me work. I want purpose, she said firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. I need to feel useful. Jonas thought for a moment, standing upright and wiping metal dust from his hands. He walked over to a small stack of cut firewood beside the wall and pointed. You can sort those by size. Big ones left, smaller ones right. Tala stepped down from the porch and approached the pile. She kneeling carefully, running her fingers along the rough surfaces. Her movements were cautious at first, then gradually confident as she understood the simple task. Jonas resumed his work at the shed, but he glanced over occasionally, noting how she handled each piece with careful intent, as though the arrangement meant more than just fuel for the stove. After some time, Jonas set the repaired hinge in place and tested the door. Satisfied with its sturdiness, he walked toward Tala, who was still sorting the wood with focused attention. You did more than enough, he said. She sat back on her heels, breathing a little harder from the effort. I can do more. You will, but not all in one day. She lowered her hands, absorbing the boundary he had set without feeling reprimanded. He didn't treat her like a burden or a tool, just a person trying to regain footing. The realization unsettled her, but in a way that loosened the tightness in her chest. Jonas looked toward the hills. The wagon was now a faint outline against the earth. We need to talk about where you go from here, he said, choosing his words carefully. Her pulse quickened. You want me to leave? I didn't say that. I said we need a plan. This place is isolated. Anyone looking for you won't find you easily, but I need to know if you have somewhere else to go. Tala's voice cracked slightly. I have no one. Jonas nodded, not surprised. Then you stay until you decide otherwise. The sentence wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was simply offered like a practical truth. But it hit her with more force than she expected. Her knees weakened, and she sat fully on the ground, gripping her hands together. Jonas crouched nearby, not touching her, just grounding her with his presence. You're not trapped here, he said quietly. You're safe here. That's different. She lifted her gaze slowly. For the first time, the terror in her eyes eased into something more complex. Uncertainty mixed with the smallest trace of hope. Jonas stood, brushed dust from his palms, and held the door open. Come inside. It'll get colder soon. Tala followed him into the cabin with a steadier step than she'd had since he found her, carrying the new understanding that safety was not the same as being owned. It was the first shift in her world that felt real. Morning arrived without color. A pale, washed-out light spread slowly across the basin, too weak to warm the ground but bright enough to reveal every uneven mark in the dirt. Jonas stepped outside first, pulling on his coat while the cold bit through the fabric. Tala followed a short distance behind, her steps careful but no longer trembling. She kept her arms close to her body, not because she feared him now, but because the open space still felt unpredictable. Jonas crouched near a line of sagebrush, scanning the soil with the trained focus of someone who had survived too many ambushes in his former life. Tala watched him from a few paces away, trying to understand what he searched for. He didn't explain right away. He wanted to confirm what he saw before speaking. A faint trail crossed the dirt, shallow, uneven, not from his horse. Jonas brushed his fingertips over the impression. "These tracks weren't here yesterday afternoon," he said. Tala stiffened. "Men, not the ones who abandoned you," he replied. "Different riders. Two horses moving slow." He stood and looked toward the far ridge. Could be travelers. Could be scouts. Hard to say. Tala wrapped her arms tighter around herself. She hated the feeling of being hunted, even if the threat wasn't certain. Jonas noticed a shift in her breathing and adjusted his tone. "They didn't come close to the cabin," he added. "Track stopped near the ridge and turned west." She released a thin breath, but her eyes kept sweeping the horizon. Habit, deep, old habit, commanded her to check every direction twice. "Come on," Jonas said softly. "I'll show you something." He walked toward the well, keeping his pace slow so she could follow without feeling rushed. When they reached the old stone ring, he pointed at a patch of disturbed dust near the base. "Always look for changes like this," he said. "Wind patterns are predictable out here. When something breaks the flow, it stands out." Tala kneeled beside the mark, studying the uneven edge. "Prints. Could be an animal," Jonas said. "But you check anyway. Danger doesn't always announce itself." She gave a small nod, committing the advice to memory. Jonas watched the concentration on her face. It reminded him of younger scouts he trained years ago, sharp minds forced to learn quickly because survival demanded it. When they returned to the cabin, Jonas opened the door and motioned her inside. Tala stepped in first, pausing near the stove as if measuring the room again. She was getting used to the space, but certain gestures, keeping her back near a wall, tracking Jonas's movements with the corner of her eye, remained ingrained. Jonas set his hat on a peg. "I need to check the northern fence today. That's where cattle tend to break through." Tala lowered herself to sit on the stool by the table. "You go alone?" "I always do," he answered, stacking tools into a small leather satchel. "But today I want you to stay where you can see the cabin door." She glanced at him with uncertainty. "You think someone will come?" "I think being prepared costs nothing." She didn't disagree. Her mind replayed the faces of the men who traded her like goods. Every laugh, every shove, every bargain made over her future. Fear tightened her stomach at the thought of more strangers approaching this land, but she pushed the feeling aside. Jonas had gotten her through one night without demanding anything from her. That alone changed something inside her. Before he left, Jonas stood near her and spoke in his measured tone. "If anyone approaches, you stay low. Don't run unless you see a weapon. Running gets you killed on open ground." Tala swallowed hard. "You come back." "Yes." He didn't smile. He didn't offer reassurance. He couldn't guarantee. But the certainty in his voice held enough weight to settle her nerves. After Jonas stepped outside and disappeared beyond the shed, Tala moved through the cabin slowly. She traced her fingers along the edge of the table, noticing small burns from old lanterns. She studied the tools hung neatly along the wall, seeing how Jonas maintained everything with meticulous care. This wasn't the home of a careless man. It belonged to someone who learned the cost of being unprepared. Unable to sit still, she pushed open the door and stepped onto the porch. The ground crunched beneath her bare feet as she approached the firewood pile she had organized the previous day. She ran her hand over the stacks, appreciating the simple order. It made her feel useful in a small way, a rare feeling after months of being treated as nothing more than an object for trade. A distant sound cut across the wind. Not a horse, not a wagon, something smaller. She turned quickly, scanning the ridge, but saw nothing. The sound faded as quickly as it came. Still, her pulse wouldn't settle. Jonas returned almost an hour later, his boots coated in fresh dust. Tala met him halfway across the yard, something she hadn't dared to do before. "Fence?" she asked. "Fixed. For now." He noticed the tension in her shoulders. "What did you hear?" "Something moving," she admitted. "Far away. Couldn't see it." Jonas's gaze sharpened. He looked toward the ridge she pointed to and studied the land for a long, thoughtful moment. "Could be an animal," he said. "Could be nothing." She searched his face. "But you don't believe that." "I believe we stay alert," he replied. He walked past her toward the porch, but Tala didn't move. She watched him remove his gloves, saw how his jaw tightened in quiet concentration. Jonas rarely reacted outwardly, but his silence held clues she was learning to read. Inside the cabin, he sat at the table and unrolled a map worn along the folds. Tala stepped closer, drawn by curiosity. Jonas tapped a point on the northern ridge. "Here's where the tracks turned. If they return, they'll likely follow the ridge line again." Tala's knees felt unsteady. She didn't want danger anywhere near this place. Not because the cabin was safe on its own, but because Jonas had given her a sense of stability she hadn't felt in years. Jonas noticed her unease. "You're not going back to anyone," he said quietly. "Not while you're here." The words hit her harder than she expected. Not spoken with authority or promise, just a fact stated plainly, like everything else he said. It grounded her more than any comforting phrase could have. Later, as the sun dipped below the basin, Jonas prepared a simple meal. Tala helped without being asked, handing him utensils and arranging plates with small, steady movements. They ate with few words, the silence no longer filled with fear, but something calmer, sturdier. When the lantern flickered against the walls, Tala sat on the cot and watched Jonas clean his knife. She noticed how he checked every detail of the blade. Careful, practiced, exact. It told her everything she needed to know about the kind of man he was. Not gentle, not overly kind, but controlled. Reliable. Predictable in the ways that mattered to survival. Before lying down, she spoke quietly. "What do I do tomorrow?" Jonas paused, knife in hand. "Whatever helps you breathe easier." The answer surprised her with its freedom. As the cabin settled into stillness, Tala closed her eyes with a new awareness. Fear was still present, but now it shared space with something else. Something she didn't dare name yet. Not trust, not comfort, but the beginning of believing she might stay. The light faded early that evening. Thin clouds drifted across the basin, dimming the last stretch of daylight until the cabin stood alone in a bluish hush. Tala sat on the edge of the cot with her knees drawn slightly together, watching Jonas prepare the stove for the night. The fire crackled in short, uneven bursts before settling into a steady glow. The warmth filled the room slowly, pushing back the cold that seeped in from the cracks in the logs. Jonas moved through the cabin with quiet efficiency, checking lantern fuel, adjusting the iron latch, inspecting the rifle before setting it aside. Tala had become familiar with his routines, noticing that he never rushed, never wasted movement, and never made noise when he could avoid it. His silence wasn't cold. It was discipline shaped by years of caution. She wrapped the blanket around herself and cleared her throat softly. "You always do all these things before night comes." Jonas didn't pause. "Habit," he said. "Wind changes fast out here. Nights can surprise you." Tala nodded, absorbing the lesson. She remembered nights in other places where danger arrived without warning. Shouted orders, boots against the ground, the sound of rope sliding along wood. Her chest tightened at the memory, and she forced her mind back to the present. Jonas struck a match and lit the lantern near the table. The room brightened in a warm circle, casting his shadow along the wall. Tala studied the way he handled the flame, controlled, steady, confident in his surroundings, yet always alert. "You had a different life before this place," she said quietly, not as a question, but as an observation. He glanced at her, the lantern light catching the edge of his tired eyes. I did. You don't talk about it. Not because I'm hiding. Just don't see any use in revisiting it. Her blanket slipped from one shoulder, and she adjusted it with a small, nervous shake. Do you think the men who left me might return? Jonas straightened, weighing his answer. If they cared, they wouldn't have tied you and walked away. That kind of group moves on fast. She didn't feel entirely reassured. But strangers pass the ridge. That's different, he said. Not every rider is trouble. But trouble finds people like me. Jonas leaned against the table, crossing his arms. It was one of the rare moments when he gave her his full attention. You didn't choose what happened out there. You don't owe shame to men who treated you wrong. Tala lowered her eyes. She hadn't expected him to speak so directly. The sincerity in his voice reached something deep inside her, something buried under days of humiliation and fear. Jonas softened his tone. You're safe tonight. That's what matters now. The cabin settled again. The wind outside pressed lightly against the walls, but didn't rattle anything. Tala listened to the faint whistle through the windows and realized she wasn't shaking for the first time in days. Jonas moved to the shelves and pulled down a small tin plate. You eat enough today? He asked. I tried, she answered. My stomach still hurts when I eat too fast. That'll pass. He set bread, jerky, and a tin of cooked beans on the table. Tala joined him, sitting across from him with careful posture. She took a small bite and watched him as he ate in silence. His presence made the room feel less like a place she was trapped in and more like a place she was learning to navigate. Jonas, she said finally, voice steady but quiet. Why did you live out here alone? Not the short answer, the real one. He didn't look surprised by the question. Instead, he wiped his hands on a cloth and rested them on the table. I followed orders once that led to people dying. Civilians. I didn't know the full picture. Should have questioned more. Didn't. And when the truth came out, I walked away from the uniform and the world with it. Tala held his gaze. You blame yourself. I should. I could have done better. Does living out here fix that? No, he admitted, but it keeps me from making new mistakes. She watched the way his fingers tightened slightly, revealing the weight behind his calm expression. She didn't pity him. Pity felt insulting, but she did understand him. They were both people who carried the consequences of choices that weren't fully theirs. You saved me, she said softly. I helped someone who needed it. That's saving. Jonas didn't reply. Instead, he stood and checked the stove, adjusting a log that had shifted. Tala saw the conflict in his shoulders, the discomfort of being thanked and the instinct to deflect it. When he turned back, she spoke again. You say I can stay until I decide otherwise. But what if I don't know what I want yet? Jonas considered her question carefully. Then you stay until you know. This isn't a prison. Tala breathed a slow, shaky breath. I'm not used to being given choices. Then start small, Jonas said. You choose where you sit. You choose when you rest. You choose when you speak. Tala's throat tightened. Those seemed like simple freedoms, but they felt enormous to her. She looked around the room again, noticing it differently. Less like a shelter she stumbled into, more like a space where her presence didn't feel intrusive. Another gust of wind brushed against the cabin. Tala shifted on the cot, pulling the blanket tighter around her legs. Jonas extinguished one of the lanterns to save fuel, leaving only a warm glow near the stove. You'll sleep better tonight, he said. Why? Tala asked. Because you know the door is locked, the land's clear, and you're not alone. The words were plain, not comforting on purpose, but the clarity in them settled something deep inside her. She lay back slowly, letting the blanket cover her completely. Jonas returned to the table and began sharpening a knife, the scraping sound even and controlled. Minutes stretched into an easy quiet. Before sleep overtook her, Tala spoke once more, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonas, if danger comes again, I want to help. Not hide. He paused mid-motion. Then I'll teach you, he said. When you're ready. She closed her eyes, holding on to those words. Not because they promised safety, but because they treated her as capable. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Tala drifted into sleep aware of her own strength, not her vulnerability. And Jonas, sitting by the table with his tools neatly arranged, realized he had begun thinking beyond the habits that kept him isolated. The night deepened around them, not as a threat, but as a quiet witness to the beginnings of trust. The sky cleared by sunrise, leaving a crisp chill that wrapped the basin in sharp clarity. The wind carried only a faint whisper through the sagebrush, and the sunlight spread across Jonas's property in long, cold beams. Tala stepped outside before Jonas did, her blanket draped over her shoulders, her bare feet cautious on the cold ground. She had slept more deeply than expected, waking with the unfamiliar sensation of having rested without interruption. Jonas joined her several minutes later, fastening the last buckle on his vest. He noticed her standing near the porch, studying the tracks she had left yesterday while sorting wood. "Cold morning," he remarked, his breath forming a thin cloud in front of him. "I've known colder," she replied, her voice steadier than the day before. He nodded once, appreciating her matter-of-fact tone. "We have work to do. Weather looks clear, but that never lasts out here." Tala adjusted the blanket and followed him toward the shed. Jonas opened the door, and the scent of dry lumber drifted into the air. Tools hung on the wall in precise order. Shovels, hatchets, coils of rope, a rusted saw he rarely used but kept out of habit. He pointed to a stack of boards leaning against the back wall. "Need to fix the trough," he said. "Water freezes when the boards warp." Tala ran her hand across one of the boards. "I can help carry these." He didn't argue. Instead, he lifted one end while she lifted the other. Her grip was careful at first, then firmer as she adjusted to the weight. Together, they carried the boards to the corral, each step sinking naturally with the other. It was the first moment they worked side by side without hesitation. Jonas set the boards down and crouched to inspect the damaged trough. The edges were cracked from last winter's freeze, and one side sagged from a weak nail. Tala lowered herself beside him, watching the way he examined the damage. "You always know how to fix things?" she asked. "Had to learn," he replied. "When you live alone, no one else will do it." She thought about that. Being alone had never been a choice for her. It was something forced on her when she became a burden to people who saw women as items to trade. Jonas, in contrast, had chosen solitude as a shield against guilt. Their reasons were different, yet both led them here. He handed her a hammer. "Hold this." Tala looked at the tool with a mixture of readiness and caution. Jonas steadied a new board in place. "Tap the nail in to start. Not too hard." She struck the nail once, testing her strength. Jonas nodded. Again, her second strike was cleaner. Jonas took over to drive it the rest of the way. Then he stepped aside and pointed to another section needing reinforcement. "You try this one." Tala inhaled slowly, positioned the nail, and hammered with controlled force. The sound echoed across the quiet morning, sharp, rhythmic, steady. Jonas watched her form, not correcting, only observing. She noticed his attention but didn't flinch under it. "You did it right," he said when she finished. Her expression didn't break into a smile, but her posture rose with subtle pride she hadn't felt in a long time. After an hour, the trough stood level and secure again. Jonas wiped sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "Good work," he said. Tala rested the hammer on the ground. "I used to help my mother mend tents," she said. "She made me learn to be useful. Said it kept people from discarding us." Jonas looked at her, understanding more than she expected. "People who discard others that easily aren't worth staying with," he said. Her throat tightened, but she nodded. They shared a quiet moment before Jonas broke the stillness. "Let's check the cattle next." They walked side by side toward the grazing area behind the cabin. The land sloped gently downward, giving a clear view of the small herd picking through dry grasses. Jonas counted them in silence, lips moving slightly as he kept track. Tala scanned the field too, though she didn't yet know what she was looking for. Jonas noticed her try to read his method. "You check for limping, slow movement wounds. Predators go for weak ones first." "I can learn," she said. "You already started." They walked back toward the shed, their steps leaving fresh prints in the dust. Tala felt the sun warming her back, grounding her in the present. For the first time since Jonas rescued her, she didn't feel like someone waiting for the next threat. She felt like someone doing necessary work. When they returned to the cabin, Jonas set his hat on the table and opened a small chest where he kept supplies. He pulled out a strip of dried venison and handed it to her. Eat. You burn energy today. Tala accepted it and chewed slowly. The taste wasn't appealing, but the fuel steadied her body. Jonas poured water into a tin cup and placed it near her without crowding her. As she drank, Jonas sat across from her. You want to learn more? He asked. What things? She said, leaning forward slightly. How to track, how to handle tools, how to know when the land changes. Skills that make you harder to capture again. She absorbed his words carefully. You teach me, if you want. I do. The simplicity of her answer surprised even her. Jonas didn't react strongly, but his expression softened, a subtle shift, barely noticeable unless someone watched him closely. After they ate, Jonas guided her outside again. He stopped near the well and pointed to the ground. Yesterday, you asked if the riders could be searching. Look here. Tala crouched beside him. The dirt showed faint lines, horizontal streaks left by wind-blown brush, not hooves. These marks look like prints if you don't know them, Jonas explained. Wind can trick you. She traced her fingers along one line. How do you tell the difference? Edges, Jonas said. Animal or human prints cut deeper. Wind dragged sideways. She nodded, repeating the motion with her hand. She was absorbing everything he taught her with serious attention. As they continued examining the land, Jonas noticed her movements were less tense. She was learning to stand without keeping her back against something. She was starting to look outward instead of inward. Later, they sat on the porch as the sun dipped behind the basin. The air cooled, carrying a faint smell of earth and dry grass. Jonas leaned against a post, stretching out his legs. Tala sat beside him, knees drawn close, watching the fading light. You're not afraid of being outside anymore, Jonas said, not as a compliment, but as an observation. I still fear, she admitted, but I don't feel helpless. You're not. Tala turned her head slightly, studying his profile. The scars on his knuckles, the wear on his coat, the calm steadiness in his eyes. He wasn't trying to impress her. He wasn't trying to control her. He was simply a man who had lived through enough hardship to know what mattered. Jonas, she said quietly, you trust me with tools. With your home. Why? Because you want to learn, he answered. And because nothing about you says danger. She absorbed his response with a slow inhale. No one had spoken to her like that before. As night settled, Jonas stood and opened the door for her. Get inside. Cold's coming. Tala stepped through, realizing she entered not because she was ordered to, but because the cabin now felt like a place that recognized her presence. For the first time since Jonas found her tied to that stake, the air between them felt different, still cautious, still slow, but steadier. Something unspoken had shifted, something that wasn't fear. And both of them sensed it, though neither dared name it yet. By late afternoon, the sun hung low behind a thin curtain of drifting dust, turning the basin into a muted stretch of pale gold. Jonas stood by the corral, trimming a splintered section of wood with a hatchet. Tala carried a bucket of water toward the trough they had repaired together, her movements steady from the growing confidence of the past 2 days. The quiet between them was comfortable. No tension, no fear, just the natural stillness of people who had fallen into an unspoken rhythm. Tala had just set the bucket down when she noticed Jonas pause. His hand stilled on the hatchet handle, eyes narrowing toward the distant ridge. She followed his gaze instinctively, scanning the horizon with a sharpness she didn't possess before he taught her what signs to look for. Dust rose in a thin, steady line far across the basin. Not wind, not cattle, something heavier. Riders, Jonas said, his tone low but controlled. Tala's breath hitched. Her fingers tightened around the rim of the bucket. How many? Jonas leaned one shoulder against the corral post to get a better angle. 3. Coming slow. Tala stepped closer to him without realizing it, her heartbeat thudding hard enough to pulse in her ears. The memory of being traded, hands grabbing her, voices shouting over her value, returned in unwelcome flashes. Jonas glanced at her, catching the tension in her posture. Inside, he said, not an order meant to control her, an instruction to protect her. She shook her head once. I don't want to hide on the floor like an animal. You won't, Jonas replied. You'll stay low near the window and watch. That's different. His tone carried no judgment, only practicality. Tala swallowed hard and followed him toward the porch. Before she stepped inside, she turned again for one last look at the ridge. The riders were closer now, their silhouettes clearer. 3 men on horseback, spaced evenly, traveling with purpose rather than wandering. Jonas shut the door behind them. He retrieved his rifle from the wall and checked the chamber with practiced motions. Tala crouched near the window, remembering every detail he had taught her. Stay below the ledge, breathe slow, track movement without pressing your face to the glass. Jonas stood near her, but slightly forward between her and the door. The riders shrank the distance with steady progress. Tala watched the angle of their horses, the pace of their approach. Jonas's earlier lessons echoed in her mind. Men with nothing to hide ride openly. Men looking for trouble ride quietly. Men searching for someone ride slowly, scanning as they go. These men were scanning. Tala's skin prickled with cold unease. Jonas didn't speak, but she sensed his mind working, calculating whether the men recognized the cabin, whether they had reason to stop, whether they were simply passing through. As the riders reached the edge of the property, the lead man slowed his horse and pointed briefly toward the well before turning back to his companions. They exchanged a few words too faint for Tala to hear. They're talking about the land, Jonas murmured. Not the cabin. Tala's shoulders loosened, slightly, but her fear didn't fade. Not yet. The men continued along the ridge, heading west. Their figures grew smaller until they disappeared behind a cluster of brush-covered hills. Jonas waited 2 full minutes before lowering his rifle. Tala let out the breath she'd been holding, her body sinking back against the wall. The room felt warmer suddenly, as if the danger had sucked the cold out of her bones. They weren't the ones who left you, Jonas said, and they weren't hunting for anyone. Tala stood slowly. Her legs trembled, but she forced them steady. But they looked, she said. They considered coming closer. Jonas nodded, acknowledging the truth in her observation. Curiosity isn't threat, but we stay cautious. Tala paced away from the window, her fear shifting into something else, frustration at her own reaction. I hate how quickly fear comes, she admitted. That's survival, Jonas said, not weakness. She turned to him abruptly. What if they come back? What if more men come? What if? Jonas stepped closer, not touching her, just placing himself firmly in her line of sight. Then we meet it together, he said. Not you alone. Not me alone. Something in her chest unlocked at those words. Not because he promised victory, he didn't, but because he spoke of together, a concept she had lost years ago. Jonas opened the door and stepped outside again. Tala followed, unable to stay still. The light had shifted into a softer orange now, stretching shadows long across the yard. Jonas walked toward the corral to check the fence line again, scanning for any sign the riders left tracks heading toward the cabin. Tala moved beside him. Teach me what you see, she said. He pointed to the fresh prints near the ridge. See how the weight shifts? They were relaxed, not preparing for a fight. Their horses weren't spooked. That tells you their intentions. Tala crouched beside the tracks, tracing the edge of a hoof print. And if they were hunting, stronger pressure here, Jonas said, pointing to the deeper indent. More urgency, more direction. Tala absorbed each detail with growing confidence. She lifted her chin slightly, feeling the first spark of something powerful, awareness, not fear. Jonas studied her quietly. You learned quickly. I had to, she replied. The evening deepened further. Jonas and Tala returned to the cabin and ate a simple meal. Beans warmed over the stove, a small portion of bread, and water from the well. Tala's appetite had slowly returned, and Jonas noticed her hands no longer shook when she held her plate. After eating, Jonas cleaned his rifle. Tala sat near him, watching each motion. "When will you teach me that?" she asked. "Soon," he said. "Not everything comes in a day." She nodded. The idea of holding a weapon didn't frighten her. It made her feel capable, not as a threat, but as someone who wanted to defend herself if needed. Jonas adjusted the lantern wick, creating a softer glow across the room. Tala lay back on the cot, pulling the blanket around her legs. The fear of the riders lingered, but it wasn't controlling her anymore. It had shifted into awareness, an understanding of real danger rather than a blanket panic. Jonas sat at the table with a small notebook and pencil, sketching a rough map of the surrounding land. Tala watched him as her eyelids grew heavy. "What are you drawing?" she asked. "Landmarks," he said. "Places someone could hide. Places we should avoid. Places you should know." "Why show me?" "Because if danger comes when I'm not here, you need to know how to move." Her heart tightened, but not with fear, with something closer to gratitude. "You believe I'll still be here," she whispered. Jonas looked up from the map. "You're here now," he said. "That's enough." The simplicity of his answer soothed a small, hidden wound she rarely acknowledged. As the lantern flickered lower, Tala closed her eyes, letting the events of the day settle inside her. The riders had shaken her, but Jonas's calm presence anchored her more than she expected. For the first time, she realized she wasn't just surviving beside him. She was learning to stand with him, and he was letting her. The night deepened, quiet and cold, but neither of them felt alone in it anymore. The basin woke under a thick blanket of cloud the next morning. A heavy stillness hung over the land, the kind that arrived before winter storms. The air smelled of distant moisture, even though the ground remained dry beneath Jonas's boots. Tala stepped out of the cabin a few minutes after him, her hair pulled to one side, blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She had begun stepping outside without waiting for permission, something Jonas noticed with quiet approval. He checked the sky with a long, thoughtful glance. "Storm's coming," he said. Tala followed his gaze. The clouds weren't just dark, they were layered, pressing low, moving in slow formation toward the basin. "We'll be bad," she asked. "Enough to make work harder," Jonas replied. "We need to prepare." She understood immediately. For the next hour, they moved across the property with steady purpose. Jonas secured loose boards on the shed roof while Tala gathered tools from the yard. They worked in a synchronized rhythm, each task building on the next without wasted motion. Tala carried an armful of tools to the porch when Jonas called out, "Bring the rope too." She turned back, grabbed the coiled rope from near the well, and hurried to him. Her pace no longer carried fear, only determination. Jonas wrapped the rope around a support beam, tightening it to reinforce the shed door. Tala watched him, admiring the precision in everything he did. Each movement reflected a man who learned through hardship, someone who didn't leave things to chance. When he finished, he nodded toward the cabin. Inside, coals dropping fast, they stepped in, shutting the door against the growing wind. The cabin warmed quickly as Jonas stoked the fire. Tala stood near the stove, rubbing her hands together. "You've lived alone a long time," she said. "Yes." "What do you manage storms?" "By being ready before they arrive." Her lips pressed together. She watched him lay another log on the fire, then spoke more quietly. "I don't know how to prepare for anything. Not truly. I always reacted to danger, never planned for it." Jonas met her gaze. "You're learning planning now." Her chest tightened at the simple encouragement. "You make it sound easy." "It isn't, but it's possible." They ate a small midday meal, hard bread softened with warm water, dried meat, and the last of the beans from the pot. Tala finished her portion and rested her hands on the table, tracing the wood grain with her thumb. "Jonas," she said, her voice steady but quiet, "why did you build your cabin here?" "This land is far from everything." "Because I didn't want to be found." "By who?" "Memories," he said, not breaking eye contact. "Regret follows a man too closely in crowded places." Tala studied him carefully. "And here, regret can't speak as loudly." She absorbed that. Jonas rarely shared pieces of himself, but when he did, his honesty came without embellishment or self-pity. Tala respected that deeply. The wind outside grew harsher, rattling the window frames. Jonas stood and moved to check the latch. Tala instinctively moved closer to him, her fear returning in a subtle, controlled way. Jonas noticed but didn't comment. Instead, he shifted his stance so she didn't feel small beside him. "You don't have to fear storms," he said. "Not in here." "I fear what storms bring," she replied. Jonas nodded. "Understandable." She turned away from the window and picked up the leather strap Jonas had been repairing the night before. "I want to help," she said. "You already do," he answered. "More," she insisted. He motioned for her to sit. "Then watch how the stitching works." Jonas demonstrated how to thread the needle through the thick leather, keeping the tension even so the strap wouldn't warp. Tala leaned close, her hair brushing the side of her face as she focused on every detail. When he handed her the needle, she hesitated, then steadied her breath and tried the technique herself. Her first attempt was crooked. Jonas didn't correct with criticism, only rotated the strap. "Try again," he said. The second attempt was better. The third nearly matched his precision. "You learn quickly," Jonas said, a rare warmth in his tone. Tala looked up at him, unsure whether she deserved the praise. But his expression was sincere, and for the first time, she believed him. As the storm clouds thickened, they worked together on small repairs, tightening chair legs, rewrapping rope ends, organizing supplies. The cabin filled with the soft rhythm of their shared tasks. Tala noticed Jonas humming quietly under his breath, barely audible. It was the first time she'd heard any sound from him that resembled ease. Later in the afternoon, the wind surged, slamming a gust against the wall. Tala jolted, instincts snapping back into place. Jonas reached out, not touching her, just turning slightly so she saw his calm posture. "It's just wind," he said. "Nothing more." She nodded, but her breathing stayed uneven. Jonas stepped to the stove, grabbed another blanket, and handed it to her. She hesitated, then took it. "You're colder than you admit," he said plainly. "Cold reminds me of nights I don't want to remember," she confessed. Jonas studied her a long moment. "You're not in those nights anymore." Her throat tightened. The blanket suddenly felt heavier, warmer, more meaningful than it should. As dusk approached, the storm finally broke, a rush of sleet and wind battering the land. Jonas lit another lantern, setting it near the window to gauge visibility. Tala sat on the cot, watching him move with quiet assurance. "You're calm," she said. "I've seen worse," he replied. She lowered her eyes. "I haven't." Jonas crossed the room and crouched near her, not touching, just close enough that she felt anchored. "You can learn calm, just like you learned to hammer nails, just like you learned to track dust." She stared at him, surprised by the confidence he had in her. "You think I'm capable?" "Yes." She took that in slowly. The wind roared, but the panic inside her softened. For the first time, the storm felt like something happening outside, not something happening to her. Jonas stood and grabbed 2 metal cups, pouring warm water into each. He handed one to her. She wrapped her hands around it, absorbing the heat. "Jonas," she said quietly, "when you found me, I thought I had nothing left to rebuild. I thought I was discarded." "You weren't," he said. She lifted her eyes. "Why did you help me, really?" "Not the simple reason." Jonas leaned back slightly, arms resting on his knees. "Because I saw someone who didn't deserve what happened. Because I've stood by before and regretted it every day since. This time I didn't look away." Tala's breath faltered. She tried to steady it. "No one has spoken to me like that." "You've only known people who chose cruelty," he said. "That isn't the world. It's just the worst part of it." Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. She wasn't crying for sorrow. She was crying for the shock of being treated as human again. Jonas didn't move closer. He didn't console with touch. He simply sat with her, staying present in a way she had never experienced from a man. The storm battered the cabin for hours, but Tala didn't hide. She sat upright, listening, learning to accept that the world could rage outside while she remained safe inside. When night settled and the wind softened, Tala pulled both blankets around her and laid down with a sense of security she didn't fully understand. Jonas dimmed the lantern, watching the glow fade gently across the room. Tala's voice reached him in the quiet. "Jonas, I don't want to leave. He paused, the weight of her words settling deep. You don't have to, he said softly. The storm outside weakened, but the warmth inside the cabin grew, quiet, steady, and undeniable. For the first time, Tala didn't fall asleep fearing the dawn. She fell asleep knowing she finally had a place where she could choose to stay. The storm ended before dawn, leaving the land washed in a pale gray stillness. The basin looked reshaped, its dust pressed flat under a thin crust of ice that crackled faintly as the first light stretched across the ground. Jonas stepped outside to survey the damage, brushing frost from the porch railing. Tala stood behind him, wrapped in both blankets, her breath visible in the cold air. You sleep? Jonas asked without turning. Yes, she said. Better than I expected. Storm kept me up, he admitted. Wind rattled the shed doors, loosened one hinge. We can fix it, she said quickly. Jonas glanced at her. She didn't shrink from the cold or the work. Her posture carried readiness instead of fear. He nodded. After breakfast. Inside, they warmed water for broth and shared dried meat. Tala sat close to the stove, her hands resting on her knees. Jonas noticed how she held herself now. No longer curled inward, no longer waiting for someone to strike or demand something from her. She sat upright, grounded, sure of her presence in the room. When breakfast was done, they bundled themselves in coats and stepped into the sharp morning air. The shed door hung crooked, one hinge twisted from the storm's force. Jonas fetched nails and tools while Tala steadied the door. Together, they lifted it back into place. Tala held the new hinge firm while Jonas hammered, each strike ringing clear through the basin. A rhythm formed between them, Jonas aligning, Tala securing. They hardly spoke, but their movements communicated easily, like two people who had worked through tension and reached a quiet understanding. When the door was fixed, Tala brushed with dust from her hands. Jonas, she said, eyes following the line of hills to the west. Why do storms feel easier now? He rested his hammer on the porch railing. Because you're not facing them alone. Her breath caught in her throat. Not from surprise, but from the truth of it. She felt stronger now, not because she was protected, but because she was trusted. It was a difference she never thought she'd recognize. They spent the next hour checking fences. Frost covered the wooden posts, clinging to the wire in thin patterns. Tala touched one post lightly. Cold reaches everything here, she murmured. It does, Jonas said, but the land holds steady if you treat it right. As they moved along the perimeter, Jonas noticed something in the distance, a faint trail of hoof prints, barely visible through the frost. He crouched to examine them more closely. These weren't here last night, he said. Tala stiffened. The riders? Possibly, Jonas said, but only one horse this time, moving slowly. Her breath quickened, but she didn't retreat. Instead, she crouched beside him, studying the print. Not fresh, she asked. An hour. Maybe more, Jonas said. Whoever it was didn't come toward us. Tala followed the direction of the tracks. They led toward the western ridge, then disappeared behind a cluster of brush before descending into a shallow wash. Should we follow? She asked. Jonas stood. No need. If they wanted trouble, they would have come here. She nodded but couldn't shake the memory of being tracked, sold, and abandoned. Jonas saw the shadow in her expression. He stepped closer, not touching her, but offering certainty through presence. Listen, he said, those tracks don't change your safety. Not here. Why are you so sure? She asked. Because I know what men look for when they want someone. They look for easy targets. This place isn't easy. Her shoulders eased slightly. She drew in a long breath, letting it settle her. They returned to the cabin as the wind shifted, carrying warmer air. Tala removed her blanket and began preparing the table for their midday meal. Jonas tended the stove, slicing dried meat to warm in a small pan. Midway through the meal, Tala spoke suddenly. I've been thinking about something since the storm. Jonas paused. What is it? About staying. Jonas set his fork down and waited. I don't want to pass through, she said, voice steady. I don't want to wait for danger to push me somewhere new. I want a place where I choose to belong. Jonas felt a weight shift inside him. something long dormant stirring again. You're saying you want this place. I am, she said. If you'll have me here. Jonas took a slow breath. His mind moved carefully, not from doubt, but from the gravity of the moment. Tala, this cabin wasn't built for more than one person. Not because I wanted it that way, because I didn't think I could share my life again. I'm not asking to replace anyone, she said, or to change what this place is. I'm asking to be part of it. Jonas studied her face, steady, clear, earnest. The firelight cast a warm glow across her cheek and softened the sharpness in her features. In her eyes, he saw no fear now, only conviction. You staying here, Jonas said slowly, changes the shape of my world. Does that trouble you? She asked. No, he said. It surprises me. That's all. Silence filled the room, but it wasn't tense. It was a step toward something both of them instinctively understood but hadn't named. Jonas moved a hand toward the edge of the table, pausing to give her room to react. Tala placed her hand near his, close enough for warmth to pass between them without touch. She didn't flinch. Neither did he. This is your home if you want it, Jonas said. Not because you were rescued, because you choose it. Tala's breath shook with emotion she fought to control. I choose it. Jonas stood and reached for something on the shelf. He pulled down a small wooden token, smooth-edged, carved by hand, a simple shape he had worked on over the last few nights while she slept. It bore no symbols, only the imprint of care taken to craft it with purpose. I made this for you, he said quietly. Not as payment, not as a reminder, as a mark that you belong here. Tala accepted the token with both hands, holding it with reverence. No one has ever given me something made only for me, she whispered. Jonas met her eyes. Now someone has. She stepped closer, slow but certain. Jonas didn't move away. She placed her hand against his chest, not forceful, not seeking possession, but offering connection. Jonas covered her hand with his, firm and steady. Outside, the basin settled into its calm after the storm. Inside, the shift between them crystallized into something undeniable. Tala spoke first. Jonas, I want a life here, not as a guest, as someone who stands with you. And I want the same, he said. I didn't expect that to happen again, but it did. She leaned forward, resting her forehead lightly against his chest. Jonas wrapped an arm around her shoulders, not claiming her, but welcoming her. No hesitation, no fear, no doubt. Just two people who had survived too much alone, finally choosing not to be alone anymore. By evening, the cabin glowed with lantern light. The wind softened. The land outside held a peaceful quiet. Tala placed the wooden token on the table beside Jonas's tools, marking her place there, clearly, deliberately. Jonas looked at her with a calm certainty that reached deeper than words. You're home, he said. Tala smiled softly, a rare expression full of new strength. Yes, she whispered. I am. Together, they prepared the cabin for night. Not as strangers, not as protector and rescued, but as partners stepping into a future they would build with both steadiness and choice. The story of their survival ended here. The story of their life together began.